All right, welcome to the lecture on optimal warm-up. So how does a warm-up work? That's one of the questions that obviously we first have to answer is why would a warm-up work? Well, three reasons. One is that it can increase the temperature of a muscle. Two, it can elevate baseline O2 levels. And three, it can change the nervous system's reactivity. So if you look at basically temperature effects, basically, if you think about your joints, people are like, oh, I'm stiff. Well, stiffness of joints is oftentimes affected by the viscosity of fluid in the joints. So when you warm up, the fluid becomes less viscous, and you have more easy motion during the exercise. Less fluid resistance, if you will. Also, what we see is that increased temperature will cause hemoglobin to shift in such a way that it gives off more oxygen. So that's good. You need more oxygen for your muscles. And then finally, increased temperature is going to increase the speed max or velocity max, and therefore it's going to also increase maximal power. So again, decreased viscosity allows for greater movement, range of motion, more fluid movement, less resistance. Also greater O2 release from hemoglobin, and finally greater velocity and max power. The other thing is when you start running or you start cycling or doing any exercise, you notice at the beginning your breathing rate's a lot more rapid, and then it sort of reaches a steady state. Well, what happens is that while it takes time to kick in, so you can be totally using aerobic metabolism. But when that's not fully kicked in yet, you have to use more anaerobic metabolism. In the process, you produce more lactate. So what happens if you warm up and then you go do your activity, you'll start with an elevated baseline oxygen, you'll reach steady state faster, and you'll be less reliant on anaerobic production of energy and therefore less lactate production. This is a study that Ryan Lowry and I did. Basically, what we did was we were looking at what's called rise time. And what you see is rise time on this graph. And basically what you see is you have the rise time, essentially how long it takes to reach maximal activation in a muscle. And in this case, we're having athletes swing a bat. Now, Ryan actually at the time was on the national championship team for the Spartans. So the higher this is, the longer it takes to maximally activate your muscle. The lower these numbers are, the faster you can activate your muscles. So what you're seeing here is that from baseline to 30 seconds after a warm-up, your nervous system can activate muscle tissue faster, and that's what we found in our lab. So basically, your nervous system can react faster when it's warmed up. So we're going to talk about warm-up for short-term, intermediate, and long-term activities. Short-term is 10 to 90 seconds, intermediate is 5 minutes to 45 minutes, and long-term is greater than an hour. So the goal on short-term activity is that short-term activities can be reliant on ATP-PC system. So what we want to do is we want to elevate temperature, but we don't want to increase lactate production, and we don't want to use the ATP-PC system. So to do that, we have to keep intensity to around 40 to 60%. At that level, we won't drain ATP-PC, and at that level, we won't increase lactate. What you can see on this graph is that at 40 to 60% of your intensity, you maximize performance benefits at around 3 to 5 minutes. So for short-term explosive activities, 40 to 60% of your VO2 max or heart rate reserve done for 3 to 5 minutes will optimize performance. Now for intermediate and long-term, remember intermediate's 5 minutes to 45 minutes. Long-term is greater than an hour. For both of these effects, the main key is to elevate baseline VO2. So you have a decreased O2 deficit, and you also have a decreased reliance on anaerobic production and decreased lactate. So when you're going moderate term, you can maximize this at around 70% VO2 max. Okay, but if you go past this, you're going to deplete substrate, you're going to increase hydrogen ions, you're going to impair performance. The duration here should be around 5 to 10 minute warm-up. Now, for long term, the thing is, long term, one of the reasons why you fatigue, like if you're running a marathon or a half marathon, is because your temperature raises so high that your nervous system reaches a critical threshold where it's like, hey, your temperature gets any higher, you're going to die. So I'm shutting you down. So you don't want to elevate baseline temperature drastically for a long run. So because of that, you can't optimize baseline VO2 because you're going to elevate temperature too much. So we recommend that you should essentially have intensity around 40 to 50% when greater than an hour. And so again, that's why you don't want to start off with too elevated baseline temperature. Now, besides warming up, there are a lot of other things. Those are what we were talking about was general warm-up. But there's other warm-ups, like specific warm-ups that you might do, or stretching, right? Now, specific warm-ups, I mean, basically you've warmed up, then you warm up specifically with your activity. So, for example, if you were to do squats, you'd warm up with that light movement, like 50% of your VO2 max, maybe on a cycle ergometer, and then you do your specific warm-up on the squat. Now, Carlos Ugrinowicz, a really good friend of mine, did a study where they found that using a general warm-up plus specific was better than a general alone. But everything people do is they might do general warm-up, then stretch, then do their activity. We see that hockey players stretch, baseball players stretch, football players stretch. It's just common everywhere. But does it work? This is a classic study by Nelson, and basically what they did was they had a non-stretching and a stretching condition. In this 20-meter sprint time, obviously the lower the number is, the faster they completed the time. So the lower these bars are, the better you did. Who did better, the non-stretching or stretching? The stretching. So stretching actually impaired performance. What you want to do, think about this, is think about your tendons as carriers of elastic energy. When you go down, your tendons and connective tissue store energy on the way down, right? And when you come back up, they release that energy and propel you, right? So someone's doing a calf raise, they come down, store energy, they come up, that energy has been stored, goes into the movement. But what is happening there? You want to think of the tendon as almost like a spring. If the spring becomes less stiff, for any given distance stretch, you'll store less energy, and therefore will help less. Okay? So basically what happened is, what Fowles found in 2000 is that stretching caused a 15% decline in calf strength. And this was explained by a 14% decline in leg stiffness. The point is that you're making your tendons less stiff, so they don't store and release energy as well. It's like deflating a basketball. It's not as stiff, you drop it, it's not going to bounce as high. And if you fill it all the way up and it's stiff, you drop it, it'll bounce very high. So what about running? Well, our lab had a theory. One thing we know is that running economy measures how many calories you expend over a distance. The greater the calorie expenditure, the lower running economy. Okay? So basically, if I'm running, if I'm expending 150 calories and you know, whatever, 20 minutes time, and the other runners run at the same speed and they're only 125 calories, I have lower running economy. Running economy determines how efficiently we use our body's energy stores. The more efficiently you use your energy stores, the better you're going to be. You're going to wear yourself out less. So we predicted this. Stretching acutely lowers muscle stiffness. There's a negative linear relationship between energy costs at a given velocity and leg stiffness in running. So basically, the less stiff you are, the greater the energy cost. Because you don't store and release energy as well. You're not as good as spring. And also, leg stiffness in runners decline as they near fatigue in a time to exhaustion trial. Those are the three facts we know. So we had extremely high athletes run and looked at their calories expended, you see the non-stretch condition is the dark condition, the light condition is the stretch condition, and what you see is that 8 out of 10 times, that means 80% of the time, people expended more calories when they stretched versus not stretching. So 80% of the time they expended more calories when they stretched versus non-stretching. So basically, stretching makes you less efficient. And we also saw that performance was down in this activity. This is a great paper by J.C. Anderson, our chair, and what he found was that stretching before and after exercise does not decrease muscle soreness or injury risk. So a lot of people will say, oh, well, if I don't stretch, I'll get injured. But we're not seeing that to be the case. So Dr. Anderson found that stretching had no meaningful effect on both soreness and injury risk. In fact, stretching may lower the force absorption ability of muscle because it makes it more compliant. So one of the questions we had is that last study was a 60-minute run. One question we had is, what if you did a short 1-mile sprint? So we had a crossover design with a stretching and non-stretching condition, and we tested people on an uphill run. And what we found is that when you stretch compared to not stretching, this static stretching, that basic performance declined by 8%. So 8% decrease in performance. 8% decrease in performance. That's a lot. This is our theoretical model that we drew up here. Basically what happens is if you go non-stretching condition, okay? If you are more of a stiff spring, when you land, what will happen is that the spring compresses less, and you're going to bounce up. If you're less stiff, when you land on the ground, you're going to stay in contact with the ground longer. The spring will stretch more because it's less stiff. You'll stay in contact with the ground longer, dissipate more of the stored energy that's in your tendons, and that means that to cover the same distance, your muscles have to work harder. So if you look, the muscle activation will be higher when you stretch. That's the second half of the graph. Then the condition where you don't stretch. That's the first part of the graph, EMG non-stretching. That's what we predicted, and look what we found. We used a model that looked at ground contact time. So what you're seeing is we use accelerometers. These are rapid accelerations. The biggest acceleration is going to happen when you have the heel strike, when you land on the ground. You can see that with the arrow. The second highest acceleration is going to be when you push off. You see that with the other arrow. And the time between landing and taking off is what we call ground contact time. That's how we calculated ground contact time. So if you look here at ground contact time, when you look at pre-stretching and post-stretching, ground contact time increases. And if you look over to the graph to the right, from pre-stretching to post-stretching, ground contact time, muscle activation increases. That means the muscle's working harder. In the non-stretching condition, no effect. So basically, stretching is making you less efficient because you have greater ground contact time and therefore greater muscle activation and therefore greater energy demands. Last topic we're going to talk about today is post-activation potentiation. One thing that we know is that the capacity to maximize muscular power is critical to the successful outcome in a number of athletic events, such as the long jump, the high jump, and in sprinting activities. So the pre-competition warm-up is a critical area of focus for its capacity to enhance explosive performance. So once you're done with a general warm-up, can you use a more explosive warm-up? One type of warm-up is used to elicit a concept known as post-activation potentiation, which is defined as enhanced contractile ability of muscle in response to a conditioning stimulus such as a heavy resistance exercise. So we did a study basically where we looked at how to optimize this concept. We looked, Ryan and I in our lab, we looked at intensity, we looked at rest period length, the type of conditioning stimulus you did, and the volume. So first thing we looked at was training status. We had untrained people, moderately trained people, which is like a year of training experience, and then highly trained people, which is greater than 3 years of experience. What you notice is that regardless of whether a male or female, that effect size, you want to think of effect size as a 0.8 to 1.0 is very high, a 0.5 is moderate, and then below that's 0.2 is low. So basically what you're seeing is that the effect, the benefit of doing a heavy stimulus, like a squat, for example, before a vertical jump, improve with greater training status. It improved with greater training status. So why do you think that's the case? Why are athletes responding to this better than non-athletes? Let me ask you this. If you haven't trained and you do a heavy squat, how's that going to affect your vertical jump? The point is you're going to be so fatigued that you may not even see a benefit. But if you're highly trained and highly fatigue resistant, you're only going to get enhanced effects. And basically what's going on, we think, is the post-activation potentiation is enhancing central drive, so you're able to activate more muscle. And then also the other thing that it's doing is it's causing effects that are peripheral, essentially, in the muscle. So the muscle has essentially these regulatory chains in them that when they're activated, you can contract the muscle faster. So those get activated with a heavy stimulus, and you can respond faster to the movement. So let's talk about intensity. We looked at very high intensities, greater than 85% of your 1RM, and moderate, which is 60 to 84%. Notice that the moderate intensities were better than the high intensities. And this is likely because very high intensities may cause too much fatigue, but moderate intensities are causing little fatigue. So if you think about it for a second, let's say that an individual can, say they can squat 400 pounds, okay? Well, 60% of that intensity, right, is going to be 240 pounds on their back. That's still a lot more. If they're a 150-pound guy, that's still a lot more, 240 pounds on your back, than warming up with just, 150 pounds. So you actually are warming up with 240 extra pounds on your back. It's still heavy weight, okay? But if they were to lift 360 pounds, that might cause too much fatigue, and that's the point. As far as rest period lengths, the untrained people are on the bottom, where you don't see any benefit from 2 minutes to 3 to 7 to 7 to 10. But if you look at trained people, their performance peaks 7 to 10 minutes after. And if you look at athletes, their performance peaks in 3 to 7 minutes after. So why is this the case? Basically, highly trained people don't need to rest as long. They're not as fatigued. Whereas trained people need longer rest because they have more fatigue to dissipate. What's happening is that the heavy warm-up causes beneficial effects that are masked by the fatigue. You can't see those beneficial effects until you rest, and that's the point. So conclusions, individuals with greater than 3 years of resistance training experience who are well-conditioned can expect moderate to large increases in power. However, in order to optimize these effects, we suggest using multiple sets. So actually, I'm not showing this data, but basically 3 sets would be better than 1 set. Moderate intensity, 60 to 85% of your 1RM. And rest period lengths lasting 3 to 7 minutes, depending on if you're trained or highly trained. Static stretching decreases performance, increases both ground contact time and muscle activation. There's no data that shows not static stretching prior to an exercise bout results in injury. Post-activation potentiation enhances contractile ability at moderate intensities with 4 to 8 minutes rest between being most optimal.